Before there was Ellen Ripley. Before there was Wonder Woman. There was the original action heroine, Atalanta. Now available at Amazon, Smashwords, and at studiobrainstorm.net. Links in the description. Before I get into the video proper, I just want to thank everyone for helping me reach 1,000 subscribers. I honestly wasn't sure if I'd get this far, or at least not this quickly. But now, thanks to you, my channel qualifies for monetization, which is good since at the moment, given the economy at the time of this recording, people are understandably using their money for things like making sure they have enough gas or food, and not so much in buying books like mine. The funny thing is, I'd actually already intended to do World of Darkness for October, as it was the appropriate time of year for it, and was planning that something else would be my 1,000 subscriber special. But things don't work out as you plan, sometimes for better, sometimes for worse. So let me just thank you all again for helping me get this far, and move on to the part of the video that you actually care about. So, the World of Darkness. How I discovered this particular universe is actually a pretty weird story. For you see, despite it being one of the most prestigious and famous tabletop RPGs, along with the likes of, say, BattleTech and D&D, I'd never heard of World of Darkness until a few years ago. Oh, I knew the name Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines, of course. Even as a non-gamer, it's just one of those titles that you can't help but hear about if you're on the internet for long enough. But I was never much of a vampire fan, and so never looked into the game, and thus knew nothing of it other than that it was an RPG with a seemingly cumbersome title. But then, a few years ago, as I said, another game came out that did catch my interest. Werewolf the Apocalypse Earthblood. Now, I may not be much of a vampire fan, but I am very much a werewolf fan. Thus, through Earthblood, I discovered that Werewolf the Apocalypse was not only an RPG setting, it was a setting concurrent to, and in fact owned by the same people as Vampire the Masquerade. Thus, I finally discovered the World of Darkness. I've actually gotten a few requests in the past by people who want me to add this to Brainstorm lore, but I've been reluctant to do so. As much as I appreciate the success of my Legend of the Five Rings videos and the support they've gotten, I know that this is in large part due to the fact that I'm one of the few people that actually dives so deeply into the lore of that particular setting. By contrast, as much as I enjoy making my Warhammer 40k lore videos, that field is a very, very crowded one, and at this point it's pretty clear that compared to the likes of Arch, Major Kill, Luton, Adeptus Ridiculous, and Oculus Imperia, I'm clearly not bringing anything special to the table compared to them and the many, many others who do the same thing. And while the World of Darkness field isn't nearly as crowded, what could I possibly bring to the table that the likes of the Primogen, Gentleman Gamer, and Lazar of Stygia aren't already doing so much better? Well, if nothing else, in honor of 1,000 subscribers and to celebrate October, the spookiest month of the year, I decided to give it the old college try. So, what exactly is the World of Darkness? Well, in simplest terms, it's a supernatural urban fantasy setting that is most often described as Gothic punk. In that case, though, what the hell even is Gothic punk? Well, dear viewers, this is the part where I get incredibly pedantic and basically take a deep dive into the historical origins of a simple two-word phrase, starting with the punk half of the equation.
I can't believe it, the way you look sometimes.
At the risk of oversimplification, punk is the name of a subculture that originated in the 1970s and was mostly tied to the genre of punk music. Originally germinating in New York before fully coming into its own in the UK, specifically London, punk is a cultural and artistic movement that revolves around certain key themes. Themes that include but are not limited to anarchism, anti-authoritarianism, anti-corporatism, anti-consumerism, and individualism. Now, the idea of using music or art to push a message or ideology is not unique to punk. The counterculture had been doing that since the 60s. What set punk musicians, and to some extent rock and roll musicians as well, apart from this was the tone. Not for them the mellow entreaty of "give peace a chance." The noise they made was as loud and seemingly abrasive as the clothing and hairstyles of its devotees. It was a sound that was in many ways equal parts anger and gleeful rebellion, and it cheerfully told all those that disapproved to kiss its ass. Perhaps the most famous example of punk's tendency to piss in polite society's cornflakes was the UK band the Sex Pistols performing "God Save the Queen" in 1977 during the Silver Jubilee of Queen Elizabeth II, an event intended to celebrate the Queen's 25th anniversary of her ascension to the throne. If you want a more detailed understanding of punk and its history, I recommend the short documentary Anarchy in the World, link in the description. Inevitably, punk escaped the confines of music and made its way into storytelling. In 1982, the almost simultaneous premiere of Blade Runner by filmmaker Ridley Scott and the publication of Neuromancer by author William Gibson helped to forge a new genre of science fiction known as cyberpunk. Cyberpunk painted a beautiful but also terrifying vision of the future, drenched in equal parts pollutant smog and eye-searing neon. A world where the lawful authority of government was replaced by either underground criminal syndicates or greedy megacorporations, where hackers escape from this cruel reality by jacking into the artificial existence of cyberspace, and where people have so devalued their own humanity that they willingly slice away their own flesh to be replaced with cybernetics. The punk in cyberpunk referred to the fact that the protagonists of these stories, more often than not, were either near or at the bottom of the social pecking order, often outcasts or rebels, who sought to either overthrow this corrupt reality or to simply survive in spite of it. Not content with helping to invent one punk genre, William Gibson decided to make it a twofer, and in 1990, along with Bruce Sterling, co-wrote The Difference Engine. Like Neuromancer, The Difference Engine features protagonists who struggle against a greedy, corrupt, and authoritarian society. But where Neuromancer is set in the near future as seen through the lens of the 1980s, The Difference Engine is set during an alternate version of the Victorian period, mostly based around the speculation of how technology might have evolved if, say, Charles Babbage had actually succeeded in creating the world's first computer. Thus, The Difference Engine helped create the foundations of the steampunk genre. From there, the floodgates opened, and everyone just started creating new types of punk genres and settings willy-nilly. This includes the creators of the World of Darkness, White Wolf, who coined the term Gothic punk. The setting of the World of Darkness, much like the settings of Blade Runner, Neuromancer, and The Difference Engine, is a kind of dystopia. It is a very, very, very near future setting, mostly, though not exclusively, seen through the lens of the 1990s, the decade in which White Wolf produced most of the World of Darkness games. The World of Darkness is in many ways our own world and even shares most of our own real-world history, but with two caveats. The first is that supernatural creatures from classical horror run amok in secret, and two, the world is worse than the one we know. Now, at the time of this recording, that might sound hard to believe, but try to imagine even worse than what we're currently dealing with now. In the World of Darkness, humans in general are crueler, greedier, and more self-centered. Things like political corruption, crime, and poverty are more widespread. Society in general seems to be both rigidly ossified and yet simultaneously slowly decaying before your very eyes. And, just to put the cherry on top, it is a setting where supernatural monsters right out of classic horror movies run amok, usually without any regard for the common run of humanity as they pursue their own specific agendas. That's the punk half of World of Darkness. Now we turn to the Gothic. Here, though, in contrast to punk, we're starting at the end of the story and working our way back to the beginning. For where the punk influence of World of Darkness begins with music, the Gothic half ends with music. Again, at the risk of oversimplifying, goth, or goth rock, began as a spin-off within the punk genre, but eventually became its own thing even as it retained some degree of overlap with its parent genre. Goth eventually developed a sound that was all its own, and its fans, much like punk fans, took inspiration from that music to develop their own unique visual aesthetic. Where punk music was energetic, fast, and even cheerful in its anger, goth was often slow, dark, and somber. Where punk fashion and hairstyles were all about bright colors and being as provocative as possible, the goth aesthetic was almost funereal. Mostly, though not exclusively, black. Black hair, black makeup, black clothes. Sometimes contemporary, but just as often taking its artistic and aesthetic cues from previous fashions, like the Victorian and Elizabethan periods. And where the themes of punk generally looked outward, shouting its defiance of a society that it disdained, goth looked inward and was more personal, with themes of lost love and death often steeped in romantic melancholy. Goth was named such because a lot of its musical stylings and aesthetic was inspired by Gothic literature, also known as Gothic horror. Gothic horror is generally agreed to have begun in 1764 with The Castle of Otranto by Horace Walpole. The story of a lord who, after the sudden and unexpected death of his only son, becomes obsessed with preserving his family lineage and divorces his wife so that he can pursue his dead son's fiancée. In writing The Castle of Otranto, Walpole combined elements of romanticism, tyrannical fathers, tragic deaths, and star-crossed lovers, with elements of the supernatural, skeletons, ghosts, talking portraits, and ominous prophecies. According to Walpole himself, his greatest inspiration was William Shakespeare, specifically the scene where Hamlet meets with the ghost of his dead father. Quite fittingly, Walpole was inspired to write Castle of Otranto by a nightmare he once had. From that starting point, Gothic literature would flourish as part of the broader Romantic movement, persisting through the 1800s and 1900s and even into the present day, with its themes of lost love, death, and despair in the face of the inevitable. Of course, most of us are familiar with the classic examples of the genre: Frankenstein, Jekyll and Hyde, The Hunchback of Notre Dame, and Dracula. But there are also more modern contemporary examples of Gothic horror, like Interview with a Vampire, Psycho, and The Shining. But if I must single out one person to exemplify Gothic literature, it has to be Edgar Allan Poe, America's most famous depressive, and pretty much the only claim to fame that Baltimore has apart from crab cakes, pit beef, and The Wire. And when I say Baltimore, I also mean Maryland in general because, let's face it, as far as most non-Marylanders are concerned, Maryland is Baltimore and nothing else. Hell, most people still think Baltimore's the state capital. All kidding aside, however, it was Poe, angsty, depressed, and perennially broke, who essentially made Gothic horror what it is when we think of it today, with his creepy and morbid stories of death, grief, cruelty, and madness. It's thanks to him that the word Gothic in our minds evokes images of haunted castles, dusty crypts, gloomy cemeteries, and ravens staring ominously down from the branches of dead trees. But even this is not the origin point of Gothic. To see that, we must wind the clock backwards again, this time all the way back to the 12th century and the creation of Gothic art and architecture. It's not exactly clear when Gothic art appeared, that is, when it differentiated itself enough from its predecessor, the Romanesque style. However, it was a very successful art style, as it, along with Gothic architecture, lasted from the 12th century well into the 16th century. So, roughly 400 years worth of dominance. That's pretty impressive. The things that made Gothic art stand out back in its day was the fact that the human subjects within Gothic paintings were usually more lively and less static in their posturing, and they were usually smaller, thus Gothic art placed a lot more emphasis on the background and setting. I'm no expert in art or art history, so this is about as much as I can understand based on my limited research into the subject. The only other significant detail I can give is that Gothic art throughout this period mostly appeared in 4 distinct forms: small panel paintings, large frescoes or wall paintings, stained glass, and the famous illuminated manuscript. Given that this was back before the printing press enabled mass production of printed works, all books in those days were made by hand, and when made into an illuminated manuscript, a book was as much a work of art as it was reading material. The origin of Gothic architecture, on the other hand, is far easier to pinpoint. The Basilica of Saint-Denis, completed in 1144, is considered the very first work of Gothic architecture. The foundation of all Gothic architecture is the so-called pointed or Gothic arch. It had originally come from the Middle East, but the Europeans during the medieval period really went ham with this particular design. From that starting point, they created other distinctive features of Gothic architecture: massive imposing vaults supported by columns, the famous flying buttress, leering gargoyles, massive stained glass windows, and of course, the famous thin spindly towers and spires that most people think of when they think Gothic architecture. It was a style intended to reflect the grandeur of the High Middle Ages. Thing is, back then it wasn't called Gothic architecture. Back then, it was called Opus Francigenum, French or Frankish work. And that was because Gothic architecture had originated in northern France. So why do we call it Gothic now? Well, that all started with a little thing called the Renaissance. This is crucial because the Renaissance began initially in Italy, when the texts and works of the ancient Greeks and Romans were rediscovered and then translated for the first time into contemporary languages. Initially, crucially, Italian. A lot of Renaissance Italian artists came to identify themselves closely with the classical period, especially the Roman Empire, which they came to see as a golden age. As a consequence, they looked with increasing scorn upon the work of the peoples of medieval Europe, who they saw as the descendants of the savage barbarians that had ended that golden age with the sack of Rome. They wanted to bring art more in line with the style and aesthetics of the classical period. And so, these Italian artists and art critics engaged in a decades-long propaganda war in order to denigrate medieval art and exalt classical art and the newly created Renaissance style. The first use of the word Gothic to describe medieval art comes from a letter from the artist Raphael to Pope Leo X in 1518. In it, he expressed the erroneous belief that the pointed spires of Gothic architecture were derived from the pointed roofs of the huts in which the original Goths, the barbarians that had sacked Rome, had lived in. The association between medieval architecture and ancient barbarism was further cemented in 1530 with Giorgio Vasari, when he published a series of biographies on famous artists. Obviously, this is all a load of bunk, but the propaganda worked and the name Gothic stuck, and it was very soon replaced in most of Western Europe by the Renaissance and Baroque styles. However, the Italian victory was not a complete one. Gothic art and architecture still clung on in the northernmost parts of Western Europe, notably Belgium and the British Isles. There, the Gothic style persisted, and even enjoyed something of a revival in England in the 1740s, which lasted until the 1890s. Among the works built in the revived Neo-Gothic style was Strawberry Hill House, the home of Horace Walpole and the place where he had the nightmare that inspired him to invent Gothic horror. So yes, the word Gothic, an adjective used to describe a subculture, a style of music, a storytelling genre, and a form of art, originated as a pejorative cooked up by a bunch of smarmy Italians. Well, screw them, I say. Gothic art is cool, so is Gothic literature, and so is the world of darkness. And I look forward to seeing how well I do in exploring these new and uncharted waters of lore. And we'll begin with not my personal favorite, but undeniably the best setting within the world of darkness: Vampire the Masquerade. Until then.